video games are the latest in a long line of media, with an endless debate raging over whether it should be considered art or not. Personally, I believe that video games are art. Video games continue to have a large social and cultural impact ever since their inception, and art, by its very nature, is subjective. I will attempt to put forth a functional definition of what art is for the sake of this speech. As well, I will define what makes a video game for the purposes of this speech. And then I will try to show why, in my mind at least, video games do fulfill the criteria for art. Namely, I will be using the points against this argument by the late Robert Ebert. So first things first, what is art? Art is very subjective. Michaela Smith on the People, Idea, and Things journal does attempt to put forth a functional definition, although she claims it's not objective. The fact that there are criterion that are either met or not met means it is by nature objective. She attempts to distill these criterion from the writer Leo Tolstoy. He is quoted as saying, "But it is a means of union among men, joining them together in the same feelings and indispensable for the life and progress towards well-being of individuals and humanity." She puts forth 3 criteria specifically. Art is art if it has a social message, if it has some originality, and if there is a wider impact on the art community. I won't go too in depth on this particular definition. This is just to kind of lay the groundwork for what art is. The next thing I'm going to cover is the late Roger Ebert. He is a well-respected film critic. He's the only film critic to have a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, as well as an honorary member of the Directors Guild of America. Some of his stance on this were put forth in an article that he wrote, and the title of this is "Video Games Can Never Be Art." This was his stance until his death in the year 2013. Some of the quotes that he put forth that I took from this are that no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison to the works of great poets, filmmakers, novelists. He also, quote, "tends to think of art as the creation of one person," end quote, as well as one difference being that between art and games is that you can win a video game, you cannot win art. The last point that he put forth, I'm going to not quote because it would be overly long and I don't want to quote this out of context, but it boils down, at least in my understanding, that art is a matter of taste. It is subjective. So let's cover what is a video game now. Well, a video game is a video game is a play or action in which a player controls images on a screen. Without delving too deep into the rabbit hole, what is a game? We're going to use the definition as a form of play or sport played according to rules and decided by skill or luck. So some examples of what we do and don't consider video games. Specifically, I'm going to be using Metal Gear Solid as directed by Hideo Kojima. This is a video game series. There is input from the player, and through his skill or luck, he is able to progress in the story or not. Dwarf Fortress, which is a passion project by a man named Tarn Adams and his brother Zach Adams, is a video game in this definition. There is a story in which does not progress except for according to the player's skill or luck. As well, the Pokemon game series as a series I will be considering a video game. There is progression that is made through skill or luck. Specifically, what I discluded from this definition is going to be graphic novels. I'm not going to consider them games, although some might. In my eyes, there is no form of luck or skill that goes into one in order to progress. So for the sake of this conversation, graphic novels are not. So the first thing I'm going to cover is no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison to the works of great poets, novelists, and filmmakers. This is a very subjective argument. Personally, I feel that I have been more engrossed and more moved by the video game series Metal Gear Solid by Hideo Kojima, for example, much more so than I've ever been moved by the works of Dante Alighieri, his Divine Comedy, or Mr. Edgar Allan Poe's works, and I do quite enjoy reading Edgar Allan Poe stories. I just feel that for my example specifically, Metal Gear has a lot more importance culturally and societally in modern times than you will find in something that was written sometimes 100, 200, 300 years ago, depending on your specific example of classic literature or poetry. The next thing would be that he tends to think of art as something created by a single person. He doesn't say that it has to be, although I do find this is a very odd choice for him to state as an argument against video games being art, because as a film critic, he knows that film as an art form is created by a team. However, much like there is a director on a movie set or in a theater production, there is a director in a video game series, or a video game in itself if it's not in a series. For example, my example with Metal Gear Solid, the series was directed by Hideo Kojima. He is the person who managed the different teams and brought the story and the writing into a specific direction. He wanted players to have certain emotions felt, and he wanted the players to be able to receive the story at a certain pace. And for that reason, much like a director on a movie would, I feel that this qualifies just as much as a movie would, at the very least, be considered for art. And the next point that I wanted to go on is that video games can be won, unlike art. I feel like this particular argument is a nothing burger. While, yes, most video games do have a win or lose state, not all of them have one or both. Much like, the mechanics of a video game don't necessarily play into the artistic aspect of it. And I feel that much like a painting done with much better, higher quality paints and a nicer canvas would potentially turn out better than one done on scrap paper with a short pencil that had been chewed off half apart. A video game created on a well-developed gaming system with an engine and a well-written story is going to turn out much better than one that is made in somebody's garage. However, my example of Dwarf Fortress, created by Tarn and Zach Adams, is a little bit different than most video games, specifically because for the most part it's actually only created by Tarn Adams. And his brother Zach Adams does help on occasion and does receive credit for his help. However, the direction, most of the coding and implementation and testing is done by Tarn Adams himself. And his video game Dwarf Fortress actually received a place in the New York's Museum of Modern Art, which I find very interesting. It's one of the few that did. And lastly, the point that art is subjective. This is an odd point to bring up because in the same article where he says that video games cannot be art very objectively, he also states that art is subjective. It's a matter of taste. He did in the article qualify his statement that video games will never be art, that he more probably meant that they will not be art in the lifetime of anybody alive in this day and age. However, it's still a very hard stance to take that they aren't art already, when personally I feel that they evoke the same amount of feelings that literature, classical poetry would have when they were the predominant medium. As well, we realistically judge video games by the same criteria as we do most art. We judge a video game based on the direction of the story, the quality of the graphics sometimes, or in the case of something like Dwarf Fortress that doesn't have pretty graphics, it still manages to tell a story and evoke a sense of suspense and dread depending on what's happening. And much the same way that you judge a video game based on this interaction, the feelings that it evokes, you judge a piece of art, perhaps a movie or a painting, on the feelings that it evokes, what it means to you. It is very subjective, as Roger Ebert does say. And that basically sums up my stance on this. I do apologize that it seems to be all over the place, but I feel, as I said, that if you try to put some kind of a functional or objective definition on art, that video games are going to fit into that criteria unless you specifically add clauses to rule them out, which I feel would be very biased and obviously very, very subjective. So the next time that you sit down at your computer or your home console, whatever you play, if you do play video games, and put in the video game of your choice, don't just passively take in the story or let your mind do whatever. Try to think, what is the direction of this game? What are the feelings that it is trying to evoke? Because that video game is art, much like a painting that you might hang in your wall is. And one last point that I would bring up, or perhaps some other people would bring up, is what do you do about games that don't have an artistic vision? Are they art? Games that are pumped out year after year for the sake of making money and nothing else, should they be considered art? And I would say, yeah, much the same as you might consider a painting at your local superstore art. It's created en masse simply to sell. It's painting of some random thing. There's no soul or heart behind it necessarily, but maybe you enjoy it and buy it and hang it up in your living room, but you might not enjoy it. Not all art is good art. Thank you.